You may think people only bow this deeply before fear, but what if the ancient Egyptians bowed before the Pharaoh because in their eyes, he was the last living barrier between order and chaos?
You think you understand power until you stand in ancient Egypt. A colossal royal face rises out of heat and stone, too still, too certain, too immense to feel like the likeness of an ordinary man. Beneath it, common people bow on burning ground, not with the posture of citizens before an official, but with the instinct of worshippers before something sacred. A modern mind recoils from that image almost immediately. How could an entire civilization kneel before a human being made of flesh, age, weakness, and death? How could a king who bleeds, tires, and eventually disappears still be treated as if he belonged to a level of reality above other men? But that first shock is exactly where the story begins. Because the people of Egypt were not simply kneeling before a personality. They were kneeling before a function, a structure, a cosmic role embodied in one living figure. The Pharaoh did not appear in their world as a politician in the modern sense. He appeared as a presence around whom temple, throne, statue, ritual, and distance combined into one atmosphere of reverence. Even a child growing up under temple walls would not meet the king first as a mere ruler. He would meet him as an image larger than ordinary life, repeated in stone, light, and ceremony until it felt like part of the architecture of reality itself. That is the real force of the question. The mystery is not merely why Egyptians obeyed the Pharaoh. It is why they found it natural to revere him, as if heaven itself had touched the ground through his body.
To understand that reverence, you have to leave the throne and walk to the Nile. Egypt was never a civilization floating freely in abundance. It was a narrow strip of survival pressed between river and desert, between fertility and annihilation. The Nile had to rise in season. The flood had to retreat. The black silt had to settle. Seed had to meet damp earth at the proper moment. Grain had to ripen before hunger, and harvest had to reach storage before waste or theft. Temples had to function. Canal labor had to continue. Boats had to move food and orders along the length of the land. In such a world, life was not imagined as a permanent human entitlement. It was imagined as a fragile arrangement that had to be maintained correctly. That is why ancient Egyptian power can never be reduced to politics alone. Rule in Egypt meant far more than issuing commands. It meant keeping the conditions of existence from slipping into ruin. A missed flood, a failed canal, a damaged granary, or a breakdown in coordination could become not merely an inconvenience, but a social wound. The Egyptians lived inside a system where nature, labor, food, ritual, and authority were tightly braided together. So when they developed a language of sacred kingship, it did not emerge from fantasy detached from life. It emerged from a landscape that taught, season after season, that survival itself depended on order.
This is where Mot enters the story, and without Mot, the Pharaoh cannot be understood at all. Modern translations struggle because no single word is enough. Order, justice, balance, rightness, truth, harmony, each captures only one face of it. Mot was the principle that the cosmos, the land, society, ritual, and rightful power had to remain in proper relation. When the sun rose correctly, when the Nile came in season, when offerings were made, when granaries filled, when law restrained disorder, Mot was holding. Against it stood everything the Egyptians feared most: chaos, drought, violence, hunger, rupture, darkness, and the terrifying possibility that the world had slipped out of its proper shape. That fear was not abstract. It touched fields, bread, burial, kingship, and the rhythm of every season. So the Pharaoh was never merely the head of government. He was imagined as the bearer of responsibility for preserving Mot on earth. That role raised him out of the ordinary human field even before later theology elaborated it further. A king who merely taxes and commands may be obeyed. A king who is believed to keep the world from falling apart is revered. In this logic, royal divinity is not decorative exaggeration. It is the most concentrated expression of a civilization convinced that existence itself hangs on correct order.
Once you grasp Mot, the next step becomes clearer. The Pharaoh was revered as godlike because he stood at the crossing point between the human world and the divine one. In Egyptian religion, The gods were not imagined as sealed away in an unreachable distance. They were present in the sun, in the flood, in sacred images, in temple ritual, in kingship itself. The pharaoh could be described as son of a god, chosen by the gods, or participating in divine reality with a nearness no ordinary person possessed. The exact theological emphasis changed across periods, but the structural idea remained stable. The king did not merely represent the gods from afar. He belonged, in a special way, to their sphere. That is why temple ritual mattered so much. The king entered inner spaces most people would never enter. He performed offerings, gestures, and ceremonies that were believed to sustain the relationship between Egypt and its gods. Crown and scepter were therefore not only political insignia, they marked sacred function. The pharaoh was the hinge between shrine and sunlight, between hidden sanctuary and visible kingdom, between what could be touched and what could only be trusted. To revere him was not simply to flatter power, it was to acknowledge the one figure through whom divine order was believed to pass into human life. Sacred kingship does not survive by idea alone. It must be repeated until stone remembers it for everyone. That is exactly what Egyptian ritual and royal art did. The king was shown larger than all other figures, calm where others strained, victorious where others fell, pure where ordinary life was dusty and fragile. He offered to the gods, he received blessing, he struck down enemies beneath his mace. But those enemies were never only individual foes, they also embodied disorder made visible. So when Egyptians saw the pharaoh victorious on temple walls, they were not simply watching propaganda about military power. They were seeing the proper hierarchy of the cosmos restated in visual form. Every repeated relief, festival, offering, procession, and ceremonial appearance worked like another hammer blow, fixing the same meaning into public memory. The king is the one under whom Mot survives. Court art was not interested in the king's exhaustion, doubt, illness, or age. It aimed to present the ideal essence of kingship. This is how divinity becomes socially real, not only through doctrine, but through repetition, monumental form, and a symbolic world so dense that the sacred status of the ruler begins to feel less like an argument and more like the texture of reality itself.
Religion alone does not explain the sacredness of the pharaoh. The Egyptian state explains the rest. Egypt was long, narrow, dependent on the Nile, and unusually suited to centralized coordination. Grain had to be counted, labor had to be mobilized, canal work had to be organized, storehouses had to function, taxes had to move, provincial officials had to answer a center. In such a system, the symbolic elevation of the king did more than satisfy belief. It made the machinery of power cohere. If the ruler is merely another man, command always invites a question. Why him? Why this order? Why this extraction? But if the ruler is understood as the living axis between land, heaven, and social balance, then obedience is folded into a larger necessity. This does not mean ancient Egyptians were simply manipulated dupes. It means they lived inside a world where administration, religion, agriculture, and survival reinforced one another. For an official writing numbers, for a farmer watching flood levels, for a laborer called into royal service, the sacred center of rule could feel internally logical. Divinization, then, was not only theological, it was structural. It allowed centralized power to appear not arbitrary, but aligned with the way the world was supposed to work.
Another layer deepens the picture even more. The pharaoh was not only sacred because he mediated between gods and humans, he was sacred because he embodied Egypt as a unified whole. Upper and Lower Egypt were not mere geographical labels on a map. In royal ideology, they were two lands that had to be held together in one living order. The double crown said exactly that. The king wore union on his head. He appeared in relief and ritual as the one who kept division from returning. In a civilization whose survival depended on coordination, unity was not a luxury, it was salvation. The king, therefore, became more than administrator or war leader. He became the visible face of non-disintegration.
people in distant parts of the Nile Valley could still encounter the same royal symbols, the same ceremonial forms, the same image of one center holding the whole together. Over generations, that continuity sinks deep into social imagination. The pharaoh is no longer just the man who rules Egypt. He becomes the image of Egypt remaining one. And in a land where disorder meant danger, the figure who kept the body of the country intact could hardly fail to rise toward the sacred.
Then comes death, and instead of lowering the pharaoh, death often raised him even further. In many Egyptian traditions, especially in the Old Kingdom and beyond, the king's death was not the reduction of a man to mortality, it was a passage deeper into sacred existence. That is why pyramids, mortuary temples, royal burial rites, and funerary texts mattered so intensely. The pyramid was never only a tomb, it was a stone declaration that this ruler belonged to another scale of being. The mortuary complex around it sustained ritual presence after biological death. Priests continued service, offerings continued. Architecture, text, and ceremony worked together to insist that royal power did not end at the grave. This helps explain the extraordinary social investment poured into royal burials. Such monuments are only coherent in a world where the king's fate matters to the whole order of the land. If the pharaoh continues among the gods, then his role was never ordinary to begin with. In that sense, the afterlife does not weaken his sacred status, it clarifies it. The dead king becomes proof that pharaonic being stretches beyond the lifespan of a single body. And when an office survives death while remaining tied to cosmic order, the line between ruler and god grows thinner still.
So in the end, what were the ancient Egyptians truly bowing to? Not merely to the personality of one king, not to raw fear alone, not to blind superstition detached from the material world. They were bowing to a structure of meaning that joined Nile, harvest, Mot, temple, unity, afterlife, and kingship into a single coherent vision. A particular pharaoh could age, fail, or die, but pharaonic kingship remained the visible form of a world still held together. That is why reverence outlived individuals. What people knelt before was not just the man on the throne, but the sacred office, the cosmic duty, the symbolic assurance that the world had not yet slipped into disorder. This is the deepest answer the files point toward. The Egyptians did not worship the pharaoh because they were too naive to know he was human. They revered him because, in their world, some humans were believed to carry more than a personal life inside themselves. The pharaoh carried Mot, unity, ritual continuity, and the promise that chaos had not yet won. That is why his image stood everywhere. That is why his authority felt larger than politics. And that is why, to ancient Egyptian eyes, revering the pharaoh as godlike was not irrational excess. It was one of the most coherent acts their civilization could perform.
They did not revere the pharaoh because he was merely powerful. They revered him because, to them, he was the human form of a universe still being held in order.